The best of Money Matters. The Big Story.
Welcome to The Big Story. I'm Hongbin Jeong. K-pods, a slang for e-vaporisers contaminated with drugs, have been at the center of public attention this week with the Straits Times launch of an anti-vaping campaign on July 13th. In recent days, videos have emerged online showing mostly young individuals exhibiting zombie-like behavior and erratic movements after inhaling vapes tainted with etomidate. Etomidate, typically used as an anesthetic in hospitals, is classified as a poison under the Poisons Act, and its administration is tightly controlled. Several parents have come forward to share harrowing accounts of their children engaging in self-harm or suicide attempts while under the influence of these substances. Just how severe is this K-pod epidemic in Singapore? And why does the vape scourge here concern everyone? And joining us now to tell us more is Melvinderpal Singh Ishar, who is the deputy news editor at the Straits Times. Hi, Melvin. Welcome to the show.
Hi there.
Thank you so much for joining us. Well, Melvin, what's driving the K-pod epidemic here in Singapore?
Okay, first of all, just to address one misconception, I would argue that in Singapore it's not yet an epidemic. I would say, though, that it's a crisis. So the public education campaign that the Straits Times is involved in, and to be fair, many agencies, including the Health Promotion Board, HSA, Health Sciences Authority, etc., have been involved in, are really shaped around preventing the possibility of an epidemic hitting Singapore. What's driving it? The quick answer is that an ease of access, meaning chaps are buying it on social media platforms. They're getting influenced by people online who claim that it's safe product to use, etc. Shifting attitudes among the young about drugs, but also attitudes about vaping. And at the same time, you have a boom in manufacturing in the region. Drugs and, in particular, synthetic drugs. And in the region, I mean Asia and Southeast Asia.
Okay, well then, is this K-pod crisis also becoming a worrying trend in other countries?
Yes. Differently though. So for example, the K-pod crisis has been reported in Taiwan, has been reported in Hong Kong, where it's called magic oil, has been seen in Malaysia, has been seen, of course, now we are aware in Singapore. In other places, it's different. The fundamental point is the same. It's drug-laced vaporizers. Very quickly, going back to history, e-vaporizers were first marketed falsely as a safe alternative to cigarette smoking. It was never safe.
Right.
But it was presented as such. Then increasingly drug syndicates realized they could move their products a lot easier if they were just to put it in vaporizers and tap what was an existing market, the young and vaping. You see it in UK, primarily cannabis, synthetic cannabis, or what they call spice. You see it in America, increasingly synthetic. Well, it is synthetic to begin with, but fentanyl-laced vaporizers. You see it in Australia, again through synthetic cannabis or synthetic THC. So you see it all over. But in Asia, in Southeast Asia, so when you say K-pod, it's primarily the anaesthetic etomidate or ketamine.
Well, considering Singapore's tough drug laws and, their crackdown on vapes in general, why has there been such a sharp increase in vape-related seizures here then? Do we have any data on this?
I don't think it's accurate to say there's been a sharp rise in the number of, say, for example, young people using drug-laced vapes. There's no real empirical evidence on that front. We do know that the number caught vaping has gone up sharply. The number caught selling, distributing vapes have gone up sharply. The number of vapes seized has gone up sharply. I think where we need to change the narrative is to stop looking at vaping and synthetic drug consumption as two entities. It may appear that I'm conflating the two, meaning vaping equals synthetic drug consumption. But a report by the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime make it very clear that increasingly drug syndicates collaborating with organized crime groups have realized that it's actually a wonderful medium for transmission. Young don't like to, inject themselves with drugs, etc. Vaping seems to be a safer option. So you need to start shifting your thinking where you see vaping as a different habit, a social ill maybe, from drug taking. The two, I argue, are the same. So in Malaysia, 2 in 3 e-vaporisers seized were found to contain dangerous drugs. In Britain, where vaping is regulated, so under 16, you're not allowed to vape. When they confiscate vapes from kids under the age of 16, and these were school kids, vaping in school, they found that 1 in 6 were vaping what is known as spice, synthetic cannabis. The shocking thing is many of those didn't realize they were actually vaping a synthetic drug. They thought they were merely vaping. So the point then is very simple. Anecdotally, we believe much of the e-vaporizers that land in Singapore come through Malaysia, where vaping is not banned at a national level. It's different states have different rules, but it's largely banned in Malaysia. We know that the vapes come from Malaysia, and I go back to the figure I just gave. If we are primarily getting our vaporizers from Malaysia, and in Malaysia, if they're finding 2 in 3 vapes contain dangerous chemicals, do the math. What's the likelihood that the vape you have in your hand has a high probability of containing a synthetic drug?
Right. And I'm sure many Singaporeans have read about the father who lost his 19-year-old daughter to K-pods.
Yeah.
Right. Just how dangerous are K-pods then? I mean, what are the health dangers associated with this particular vaporizer?
So again, there are no long-term studies, right? So because it's a pretty new phenomenon. I mean, the first indication we had that there was this thing called K-pod was only the start of this year. But based on what we see not too far away in the region with drug production, etc., we've seen the changing tactics of the drug syndicates and all, then it's clear that it might well become an even bigger problem. So long-term impact of consumption of K-pods, we don't know. I don't think there's a study to demonstrate long-term effect. But let's examine the impact of etomidate use via inhalation. Now, etomidate is an anesthetic. It's meant to be administered through the veins by trained professionals. When it is inhaled, it causes a whole series of problems. Aside from what normally happens in vaping, with the fumes that go into the lungs, it also causes spasms, tremors, etc. And those are the immediate effect of using K-pods via vaping, right? We have seen that demonstrated in the videos and all circulating. So if you would ask me the short-term impact of this on health, it's pretty obvious. And let's just look at what etomidate does to you if inhaled. The long-term impact, we don't know. But we do know that Charmaine was affected by it. Anecdotally, she wasn't the only one affected by it. There were a number of others who were affected by it, and they started to lean towards self-harm. If I may at this point say, if you are in need of any kind of help, there are a whole army of people who can offer help. Just reach out and contact these people to get the help you need.
Definitely. There are helplines available
Yes.
if needed as well. Well, is there any way for people to know if someone is inhaling drug-laced pods?
I mean, the most obvious would be the tremors that you see in user. There was a recent video we put out that a mother took with a security camera of her 2 sons, 27 and 23. They were both K-pod users. You could see they were disoriented. You could see that they were shaking, and you could see that they were totally intoxicated or disoriented, Otherwise, do you know what you're consuming? I think that's the difficult bit. Again, from the UNODC report, it's very clear that the drug syndicates are mixing the synthetic, what they call vape juice with all kinds of chemicals. The dosages differ. What they put in to jazz up the vape juice differ, and they're not telling you what it is. But you're inhaling it on the pretext that it's safe.
Well, the vaping issue today is being compared to what was seen in the early 1980s when Singapore was grappling with glue-sniffing. How does the current wave of drug-laced vapes compare to past substance abuse crisis here in Singapore?
Very similar, actually. It wasn't just the glue-sniffing in the 80s. So in the early 80s, there was a phenomenon where young people were getting, their fix on inhalants, primarily glue. And this glue was widely available, bicycle shops, etc. They will use it to fix the inner tube of a tire. And they would buy this, sniff it, and then get, feel intoxicated. Problem is, it caused brain damage, and in many instances, it caused them to lose their thinking capacity, and it led to a number of falls from height. And government then moved in to regulate inhalants, and out of it came a law. And that law primarily looked at, first of all, how you have to register when you buy certain chemicals, but also at the same time prevent certain age groups from getting access to those chemicals. Much later, in the early 2000s, was a pharmaceutical product called Subutex that was introduced to help heroin addicts, heroin users defeat their habit. Unfortunately, it was prescribed by GPs, and unfortunately, drug users found that they could get a fix by mixing Subutex with other drugs and injecting themselves with it. And they were sharing needles and discarding the needles in public places, etc.
Right.
And exposing children and other people to those needles. And Subutex, and I hope with synthetic etomidate and the synthetic drugs. So with Subutex, what happened was it was reclassified as a controlled drug, a controlled substance. And it became a Class A drug under the Misuse of Drugs Act, where previously it was governed by the Medicines Act. Now, the problem with the Medicines Act was that the police couldn't arrest someone selling Subutex out in public. Back then, there was a unit called the Pharmaceutical Board. Enforcement officers from the Pharmaceutical Board catch them for selling prescription drugs without a license, which has a lower penalty than, say, for example, under the Misuse of Drugs Act. Give you a simple example. If etomidate is classified as a Class A drug, you go from a maximum penalty of 2 years for selling an etomidate lace vape to a maximum of 10 years for selling a Class A lace vape. So the penalties are far more severe if it falls under the Misuse of Drugs Act. As it stands now, we have amended our laws around synthetic drugs, or what we call new psychoactive substances. And we have amended the laws further to include more compounds, but also to look at policing the effect of synthetic drug, not just the compounds. In other words, if you look like you inhale something which is a synthetic compound that is giving me reason to believe that you have consumed a controlled drug, I can therefore arrest you based on the effect. I do not need to verify the chemical compound of the substance. That's very powerful, and I'd argue that that may need to be considered for, lace vapes, including etomidate.
Well, speaking of which, in the news today, a man who allegedly made K-pods at home has been charged under the Tobacco Control of Advertisements and Sale Act. Is this the first of its kind in Singapore?
As far as we know, yes. As far as we know.
Okay. Well, are the penalties under the Tobacco Act then sufficient to deter vape-related offences?
So if you were to stick strictly to the old narrative, which is that the vape governed under the Tobacco Act, and your question is really in relation to that explanation, then I'd say yes. But if you switch your narrative to say, if you consider vape as far more dangerous than just inhaling tobacco, nicotine, then I would say no.
Okay.
I would say the law is not good enough to punish someone. Here's an example of where the NPS laws are powerful. There is a clause in the laws around NPS where it says, if you introduce a chemical into a product and make this product available to the children, potentially knowing the effect of this chemical, you can be in breach of laws under the Misuse of Drugs Act. But first, that chemical, etomidate, say for instance, has to fall under the Misuse of Drugs Act and potentially classified as a Class A drug. So in other words, if you decide to come up with your own cocktail, a vape juice where there is nicotine or whatever it is, and introduce etomidate to it, potentially I can now punish you under the Misuse of Drugs Act, not under the Tobacco Act. And the Misuse of Drugs Act carries a far heavier penalty.
Definitely. Well, the Ministry of Health and Ministry of Home Affairs says government agencies are considering further steps to better address the vaping issue, including whether current laws for enforcement can be enhanced. So considering the magnitude of the ongoing crackdown on K-pods over the past week, what other steps can the authorities consider to curb this crisis?
I don't think you can enforce your way out of this problem. So there has to be greater public education. There have been multiple studies around the world to show that it has worked, turning people off the idea of vaping, warning people of the dangers of synthetic drugs. I do think you need a very strong public education element. I think the public education element has to be also targeted. Not just a general public education a poster on an MRT station. I think it needs to be very targeted. For the young people, it could well be tapping influencers. People like yourself, you're young, people like yourself speaking up about it, warning people that vaping equals drug taking. Don't see the two as separate. I do think that part of it is very, very important. As it stands now, the different agencies are already tackling it on multiple fronts. The Immigration and Customs Authority are tackling it over there. MHA is looking at the various drug syndicates. HSA has taken down multiple Telegram sites.
Right.
The social media platforms are working with government agencies to police their sites to ensure that these chaps are not selling illicit products on those places. But there's a shifting attitude among the young in terms of, let's call it, they are far more, they find drug taking far more acceptable than the older generation. So if you have that attitude, then you have demand. Meanwhile, you have a boom in production, you have supply. And then into that mix, you have the ease of movement.
Right.
So you have to change that attitude where demand is concerned.
Melvin, in April, a 13-year-old girl vaping erratically outside the state courts led to a raid on her home, revealing an etomidate-laced vaporizer. Should Singapore, mandate routine drug testing for vape-related offences, especially in schools, to protect minors then?
So that's the difficult one, right? I mean, I don't know if people in Singapore have an appetite for that. So you said, glue sniffing in the 80s. Let me take you even further back, 1977. Singapore launched Operations Ferret. And what they did was to tackle the problem of heroin consumption. There was a heroin epidemic. Singapore actually went out, and within the first 2 weeks, if I recall, 900 people were arrested for suspected drug consumption. And the law under the Misuse of Drugs Act allow law enforcement agencies to haul up someone on suspicion of having consumed a controlled drug based on a series of criteria. Now, the person will then be detained, subjected to tests, generally urine or hair tests, to trace, these chemicals in them. Would you find it palatable if students are also hauled up? We do know that synthetic drug use is popular among young. We do know that government statistics show that the median age for chaps arrested for drug consumption has fallen down to something like 15.9 years.
Right.
So that means a lot of young people may be hauled up under the Misuse of Drugs Act and subjected to, urine test, detention, etc. I don't know if we have the appetite for it. Do I think it's necessary? I don't think we are there yet. So I go back to the first point I made. We are not at the level where there's an epidemic. We do know there's a real risk of it becoming an epidemic.
Right.
So I quote, former Home Affairs Minister, Professor S. Jayakumar, you have to act swiftly if you want to prevent something like this from ever becoming an epidemic.
Right. Since we're at a real risk here, how can schools or parents then play a stronger role in prevention and early detection of drug-laced vaping among the youths?
Like what we are doing here, talk, at assemblies, talk. Nobody is immune to this. From your best schools to your otherwise, talk. Parents, have conversation. I'm trying to get a sense of the desperation that the families had when they wrote to us. We could see, and these were the articulate people, right? They wrote to us lengthy letters telling us what they've been going through, how they've been turning here and there to get help. Fundamentally, it appears they didn't know who they could talk to.
Right.
So I think you need to get the conversation started, parents with the children, schools with the students, schools with the teachers. I think that has to start. And that's where I hope ST has played a part in contributing to starting that conversation at a wider scale.
Right. And definitely, if our listeners want to find out more about K-Pods and what is happening here in Singapore, the Straits Times have an extensive coverage on the Straits Times, so do check them out. Well, ST is launching Vaping, the Invisible Crisis campaign to raise awareness about this, advocating for measures like vaping reporting app and increase ministry involvement to tackle the issue. How has ST been working with agencies in Singapore on some of these K-Pod related stories?
So with a lot of our stories have been with help from several agencies. I mean, the big one is the Health Sciences Authority. They, are aligned with us on the public education front, especially the Health Promotion Board as well. The Ministry of Health, Ministry of Home Affairs, they've all been on board in getting the message out there. We've first of all highlighted what's being done on the ground, and that you can see from the enforcement action, the operation in Bishan and Yishun, the operation at the around areas around the 5 institutes of higher learning island-wide. And at the same time, you would have seen a number of cases in court as well, convictions. So on the one front, there's the enforcement element, but there's also the public education element to raise awareness of what's on the horizon and also the public education tools that are out there. So in today's report, Zaihan and Andrew wrote a piece on, what is the situation in schools here, and what teachers are seeing anecdotally. But at the same time, schools have put out advisories. Again, I go back to Health Promotion Board. They have put out their programs to help young people. We know for a fact that a number of parents have actually approached different agencies to ask for help. So definitely there's a multi-pronged, multi-agency approach ongoing. Perhaps what we have done is help sharpen the focus and hopefully persuade some people to see or change the narrative from vaping as a separate entity to synthetic drug consumption.
Well, are there any interesting cases that you can share with us that occurred during the raids as well?
Well, the agencies will be a bit wary to share operational details. But, the HSA officers, we saw them in action. They're incredible chaps. They've been working long hours and they've had to handle multiple cases, multiple operations per week. What you are seeing is when they have made it perhaps on public display, via the Straits Times. But they've been doing this and they have actually been putting out releases and statements on the numbers they have hauled up. I'll give you an example. 2 of their biggest hauls, 6.5 million, more than 2 million. So these are not small, 3 fellas over there with 5 pots each. These are major hauls and they've been very successful on that front. Where I think HSA may need support and help would hopefully come from the other agencies joining in that enforcement effort. Whether it's a multi-agency enforcement blitz, I don't know. I leave it to the experts.
So what is the overall message that the Vaping, the Invisible Crisis campaign is looking to make?
Simply this, I just met a colleague as I was walking down here in the lobby and she said, when she read the stories and all, the first thing she did was have a chat with her children and at the same time check her children's school bags. And I think that's actually not a bad thing. We have seen examples in America and UK primarily where children were given e-vaporisers, e-cigarettes by friends. And the friends may or may not know that the devices were laced with synthetic drugs. And that's how some of them end up being exposed to it. On the horizon, we have a report coming up on a young boy who was introduced to it by a friend and who became addicted to it and just couldn't quit, and his parents implored with him to quit the habit and he just couldn't stop. And he only did when one of his friends died.
Before we let you go here, Melvin, seeing that this is still a developing situation, what will you be looking out for in the coming days and weeks?
I think we're still receiving a lot of emails from families. I expect that to continue for some time yet. I expect the different agencies to be a little bit more vocal in their approach towards vaping, whether they see vaping as more than just inhaling tobacco or nicotine or whatever it is. What do I see going forward? I see a lot more conversations. I do see MPs raising the matter in Parliament. I hope to see changes. But I think, we just need to also at the same time temper what we are seeing now, and we don't want to go overboard by, hauling up everyone off the streets and subjecting them to urine tests. That, I fear, may be sending the wrong message. Do I see, as a result of these stories, certain things going underground? I think so. I do think there is demand, there's an abundance of supply, and because of the ease of access, this will continue for some time yet. But at least we are now aware that vaping has never been safe, even more so now.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much, Melvin, for joining me today.
Thank you.
That was Melvinderpal Singh Ishar, who's a deputy news editor at the Straits Times. Now, before we end off, here is a public service announcement. To report vaping offences and the sale of vaping devices to the authorities, the public can contact HSA's Tobacco Regulation Branch on 6684-2036. That's 6684-2036 or 6684-2037. That's 6684-2037 from 9 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. on weekdays. This has been The Big Story with me, Hongbin Jeong.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.